Hi there, AP Euro students, and welcome to today's lecture 7.5, The Age of Mass Politics. Now, I'm going to give you a heads up. This is a big lecture because it's a big, complicated topic. We're going to be taking a look at the political circumstances of many different nation states in Europe in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so I have divided this lecture up into smaller chunks. So I just want to make you aware that from the get-go that there's going to be several different videos in this lecture that you will have to complete. And I definitely encourage you to take breaks between each video. Don't try to do it all in one sitting. The theme for today's extremely long lecture is going to be states and other institutions of power. That is our political theme. And the objective, which is also your write-up, is to explain how nationalist sentiment and political alliances led to tension between and among European powers from 1870 to 1914. And that's really going to be the period of history that we're looking at, 1870 to 1914. So the tail end of the 19th century and then the beginning of the 20th century before World War I. So this period is often referred to as the age of mass politics for a variety of reasons. First of all is the importance of nationalism, and the age of mass politics definitely will coincide and reinforce and be supported by the development of extreme nationalism in European politics as well. During this time, ordinary people felt increasingly loyal to their governments. And this was encouraged by the expansion of universal male suffrage. By 1914, universal male suffrage was the norm, and giving people the right to vote actually encouraged loyalty and commitment to the state. Also, politicians and national parliaments represented the people more responsibly as increased suffrage spread across Europe. This led to a rise of multi-party systems in many European parliaments that depended on coalitions to lead. So a multi-party system, remember, is when we have multiple parties, not just two parties like in the US. And as a result, those parties have to compromise and come together and form a coalition to develop a working majority. This was also supported by the emergence of the welfare state, which is the expansion of social welfare services, first in Germany and then also in Great Britain, France, and Scandinavia. Increased literacy was another contributing factor. Governments had come to believe that public education was important to provide society with well-informed and responsible citizens. And so political parties began to dominate politics. And with this, there is an increase in the use of propaganda and press and media, which played a significant role in mass politics as well. There's also the potential for the manipulation of nationalistic sympathies, especially in governments that were led by authoritarian or more conservative leaders who often relied on charisma or relied on their ability to divert attention away from a lot of the underlying class conflicts that still permeated European society. These leaders frequently channeled national sentiment in an anti-liberal and militaristic direction after 1871. Also, the last contributing factor here is that international tensions as a result of imperialism led to more of the us versus them rhetoric and thinking within these European nation states. And we'll talk about imperialism and its effect on European politics in the next lecture. As I mentioned previously, universal male suffrage was a really important reason for the increasingly nationalistic sentiments of the era, as more and more citizens had the right to vote. This, of course, was also supported by more education and higher literacy rates. Ultimately, the right to vote recognized the individual's worth as a citizen, and it gave him a greater stake in politics. Voting was no longer attached to wealth or education. And now it seemed that these new political systems and new political parties valued the opinions of ordinary people. However, Now that the working class could vote, many conservative parties and politicians used a variety of techniques to gain the support of the working class. Nationalism was, of course, one of their primary techniques, but we will see that some conservative leaders were even willing to implement certain social welfare programs in order to gain the support of the working class. Now, the age of mass politics also, unfortunately, coincides with the rise of anti Semitism in European history. And so, we're going to take a little bit of time to talk about the significance of this anti Semitism, how it's different from, say, the anti Semitism of the Middle Ages or the early modern era. And then also, we're going to look at the development of Zionism, which is essentially Jewish nationalism. So, starting with that third bullet point, which is Jewish rights and anti Semitism, Jews began to successfully win more rights and and were integrated into European society in the later half of the 19th century. After the revolutions of 1848, Jews actually gained full rights and were equal citizens in Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, Scandinavia, and even eventually in the Austro Hungarian Empire. This meant that Jews could now serve in parliaments, they could participate politically, they could practice business wherever they wanted, they could live wherever they wanted, they could also intermarry with non Jews. However, there would continue to be a lot of prejudice and discrimination against the Jews in Russia, and we'll hear more about that later. Lots of state sponsored pogroms against Jews in Russia. And as a result, many of those Jews would leave Russia and migrate and settle into Central Europe or even Western Europe, where actually there was more toleration for Jewish minorities. Now, the 1880s is when we really see this spike in anti Semitism in Europe, and it's largely due to an economic recession. There were other factors as well, however. We will learn later about the Dreyfus Affair, which was a very controversial issue that plagued the French Third Republic. Also, certain politicians defined themselves by their anti Semitism. One of the most famous anti Semitic politicians of this period was the mayor of Vienna, a man named Karl Lueger. Karl is spelled Karl, Lueger, Luger. He was the mayor of Vienna from about 1897 to 1910, and he blamed Jews for the corruption of German culture. Keep in mind, though, that the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the city of Vienna were very multi-ethnic regions. Also, Christian socialist political parties, which popped up in many different nation states, were often anti-Semitic, and they used anti-Semitism to gain votes and the political support of lower middle class groups who felt threatened economically by Jewish people. So modern anti Semitism classifies Jews as a race and not a religion. That's the big difference between the anti Semitic attitudes of the Middle Ages, which were prejudice against Jews because they were a different religion. But now, in this period of nationality, Jews were seen as a different race. Therefore, they were considered to be permanently stained. There was also the sentiment that Jews had no country, right? That they were not capable of loyalty to a country and they were not capable of nationalism. And if nationalism defines so much of one's identity and politics and just lifestyle in the late 19th century, then this can help us understand that mistrust and that anti Semitic attitude towards Jewish people who had never had a sort of defined nation state for their people up to this point. Now, most Jewish leaders in the late 19th and early 20th century believed that these attitudes were contained, and then that these attitudes would be contained by the liberal legal protections that many nation states had implemented, with universal male suffrage and parliamentary procedure and multiple political parties. They believed that these liberal legal protections would protect the Jews and that Jews and their communities would remain safe. However, there were also a handful of Jewish leaders that recognized the long term threat that this new anti Semitism posed to their people, notably Theodor Herzl. So, Theodor Herzl was a Jewish community leader and intellectual in the late 19th century, and he became the founder of modern Zionism. And Zionism is essentially Jewish nationalism. The continued persecution and discrimination against Jews led Jewish nationalists like Herzl to call for the creation of a new Jewish state in Palestine, which was the biblical homeland of the Jewish people. Herzl founded the Zionist movement in 1897 after he witnessed a lot of the anti Semitism in the Austro Hungarian Empire firsthand. He had also closely followed the Dreyfus Affair in England and was disturbed and concerned by the pogroms in Russia that continued into the early 20th century. Now, by 1917, Great Britain had become the only other nation state to publicly support the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. They declared this with a document called the Balfour Declaration, Balfour, the Balfour Declaration. But they did this primarily to gain support from Jews in World War I. We will not actually see widespread international support for a Jewish homeland and the creation of the State of Israel until after World War II. But of course, that's another story for another day. Another significant development in the age of mass politics was the expansion of labor movements and the success, to some extent, of socialism. Now, socialism, as we know, is largely a negative response to industrialization and nationalism. The main goal of socialism was to advance the cause of the proletariat. Remember, the proletariat is another term for the working class. So they wanted to advance the cause of the proletariat throughout Europe. Socialists saw nationalism as a tool used by the ruling classes to divert public attention away from important social issues. And prior to 1914, they were generally opposed to war, as the working class often disproportionately suffered casualties on the front lines. But we will see that when World War I breaks out in 1914, the trade unions and socialist parties will be very supportive of the war effort. Now, after 1850, socialism became less revolutionary, less dramatic, and tended to focus more on supporting trade unions, political parties, and more general reform movements. We will see that this leads to a socialism that wants to create change through democratic means, working with the government instead of against it. All right, but first let's take a look at some of the sort of different types of socialism and socialist movements that exist in the 19th century. So first, of course, is Marxism. Marxism had essentially developed with Karl Marx's The Communist Manifesto. And Marxism led the negative response to industrialization. Also remember, Marxism is considered to be the radical form of socialism. Many Marxist socialists united in 1864 to form what they called the First International. They wanted to create an international union of socialists. And again, this helps us understand how that might be in opposition to nationalism, because they saw solidarity in their social class, whereas nationalism encourages solidarity within a nation state. So Karl Marx, who had been one of the principal organizers of the First International, wanted to ignore that nationalist solidarity and create working class solidarity all across these different states in Europe with this organization. This was not very successful, and in fact, more and more people began to be turned off by Marxism and its calls for, a violent revolution and the destruction of private property and these other radical ideas. And we're more likely to see the growth of socialist parties after 1871. There's going to be some significant growth in socialist parties there. And some socialist parties will even be Marxist in their ideology. We'll see also there's Marxist parties, but there's also going to be more mainstream socialist parties. Even in 1883, there were some socialists, some Marxian socialists exiled from Russia, and they formed their own little political party called the Russian Social Democratic Party in Switzerland, and it grew rapidly after 1890. So yes, Marxists could have their own political parties as they try to compete for seats in various parliaments and things like that. Excuse me. Another element in the development of socialism is the expansion and the acceptance of labor unions or trade unions. In the second half of the 19th century, workers organized more efficiently to improve working conditions. Governments also began to extend legal protections to these labor unions after 1850, and many labor unions were able to operate with relatively little government interference. In some states, they were even granted the right to strike in the 1870s. And these labor unions expanded to include more people. They began to include unskilled labor as well, which was the largest component of the working class. Labor unions were probably more successful in Great Britain than anywhere else on the continent. And while they first and foremost tries to use negotiation and bargaining to improve working conditions, labor unions also were not afraid to resort to a strike of workers to promote higher working conditions and better wages, especially in the 20th century. And we'll start to see that many labor unions would ally with different political parties that shared their same cause and their same goals. So this leads me to one of the more important developments in socialism in the late 19th century, and this is called Evolutionary Socialism or Revisionism. This is an alternative to the radical Marxism that scared many people in Europe. This evolutionary socialism was a more moderate form of socialism that did not advocate for radical ideas like a revolution and the abolishment of private property. Now, as workers gained the right to vote and the right to participate politically in the nation state, their attention focused more on elections rather than revolutions. And the growth of labor unions actually reinforced this trend towards modernization of socialism and the acceptance of moderate socialism, especially as governments were more accepting of these ideas. One of the leaders in this movement of evolutionary socialism was a man named Edward Bernstein. Edward Bernstein, Bernstein. Edward Bernstein was German. He was a member of the German Social Democratic Party, which was one of the largest socialist parties in all of Europe, and he directly challenged some of Marx's ideas in his own book, which was called Evolutionary Socialism. Bernstein argued that the middle class was actually expanding and not shrinking, which was contrary to what Marx believed. Bernstein also argued that the position of the proletariat was improving, which somewhat undermined that need for revolution. And Bernstein also discarded Karl Marx's emphasis on class struggle and revolution, arguing that it was not necessary. He believed that workers needed to organize into political parties and work within the limitations of the government in order to enact change and achieve their goals through democratic channels. So instead of advocating for revolution, create a political party, campaign for seats in parliament, elect representatives, and work with the government instead of against it to create change. There were many successful socialist parties that emerged in this period. The most famous, as I mentioned, was the German Social Democratic Party, which emerged in Germany and competed in many elections for the German parliament and were the most successful socialist parties in Europe by 1914. And socialist parties in other countries were often modeled after the German Social Democratic Party. So, overall, the argument here is that evolution by democratic means, not revolution, would achieve the desired goal of socialism. Now, of course, this moderate ideology was not supported by all socialists. Some of the more extreme Marxists saw this as heresy and a complete abandonment and betrayal of the values and the identity of what it meant to be socialist, especially since many socialist parties remained tied to national concerns and national issues, and some of these socialist parties still promoted nationalism and national loyalty, which at the end of the day proved to be stronger than class loyalties. Now, the most extreme manifestation of socialism became anarchy. Some socialists were so extreme that they were driven to anarchy. Anarchy spun off from the mainstream socialist movement. It even spun off from the Marxist socialist movement. Anarchists wanted to destroy the centralized state and all existing social institutions. They believed that this was the only way to achieve true freedom for the individual. Anarchists tended to be more common in less industrialized and less democratic countries in Europe. For example, Spain, Italy, and Russia would see more anarchist activity. A Russian nobleman named Mikhail Bakunin, so I'll spell his name for you here, Mikhail, that's Mikhail, and Bakunin is Bakunin. Mikhail Bakunin, who lived from 1814 to 1876, was a Russian nobleman who became the most influential of all the anarchist leaders in Europe in the 19th century. And while anarchists were never elected to parliament, they certainly had a significant impact on political history. They would often take the most extreme form of action, which was often violent and may even lead to assassinations. In fact, there were political assassinations of 6 national leaders by anarchists between 1881 and 1901. This included Alexander II of Russia, who was assassinated by anarchists in 1881, King Umberto I of Italy in 1900, and even a U.S. president, President William McKinley of the United States, was assassinated in 1901. So that brings an end to our first section on the development of mass politics. Stay tuned for part 2, which is going to be about mass politics in France in the 19th century.